Now I want to turn to climate change. This may surprise you. We studied the policies of both Obama and McCain during the U.S. election for combating climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we found that both McCain and Obama's policies were better than Stephen Harper's policies. So no matter who was going to win the U.S. election, chances are the U.S. would see a policy better than we had here in Canada. Both presidential candidates favored a cap-and-trade system. Obama's called climate change a man-made threat to the planet and said that fighting it will be a top priority of his administration. He will reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, and he'll also increase the tax on the big oil companies and use the revenue to pay for a $150 billion plan over 10 years to advance clean energy technology. And you'll have noticed that immediately after the American election, Stephen Harper suddenly calls for a North American cap-and-trade system to fight climate change. You know, all of this from a guy who once described Kyoto as some kind of socialist plot. I believe that with the election of Obama, Harper sees change coming, and he wants to be seen as a leader of the parade rather than following along behind him. And that's energy. The U.S. wants to rid itself of dependence on foreign oil. But the question is how? How do they do it? You know, for McCain, when he was running in the presidential election, the answer lay mainly in more oil drilling in North America. He would have lifted a ban on offshore oil drilling, and he was in favor, along with Sarah Palin, of drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, Obama has a different way. He wants to concentrate more on conservation. He has this $150 billion 10-year plan to create clean energy sources. It was key to his platform. He'll also assist auto manufacturers to make more fuel-efficient cars. He wants 10% of U.S. electricity to come from renewable sources such as solar by 2012 and 25% from renewables by 2025. It's important to note, though, that Obama and many Americans regard Canadian oil, especially that Alberta oil sands there, as part of U.S. domestic sources. Canada is now the #1 supplier of oil to the United States. We've surpassed Saudi Arabia. And there's this tacit agreement that the tar sands production will increase by 5 times over the next decade or so to increase supply to the Americans. I mean, this troubling fact, it connects back to NAFTA. We gave up a lot of control over our energy under NAFTA, our energy security under NAFTA, because NAFTA assures supply to the United States. And it gets worse because our energy-intensive production drives up greenhouse gas emissions that quickens climate change. And this has drawn criticism in the U.S., where some states are refusing to import dirty oil from those tar sands. We must use the NAFTA talks, if they come, to regain greater control over energy resources, which in turn will allow us to develop them in an environmentally responsible way. Another important area under which President-elect Obama has promised to move forward includes nuclear disarmament, where he's committed to the abolition of nuclear weapons. That's something new for a U.S. president, talking about abolition. And you may have noticed we're the coordinator at the Rideau Institute of a group called Abolition 2000, 2,000 organizations that are working for the abolition of nuclear weapons. He's also talked about scaling down missile defense and preventing the weaponization of space. He wants to rebuild the tattered relations with Russia, open up a new diplomatic front with Iran, and close down that prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, finally. If Obama can come close to delivering on any of these promises, we will be in an infinitely safer world. Now I want to come to one of the most worrisome issues that the Rideau Institute has been tracking, and that's the war on terrorism, including the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. While he says he'll set a timeline to pull out American forces out of Iraq, Obama has promised to send around 15,000 American troops to Afghanistan. I mean, given Prime Minister Harper's promise to bring our troops home by 2011, reiterated again in the throne speech recently, this week, we can expect that Obama may pressure Harper to increase our combat role in Afghanistan in the meanwhile. I mean, our position at the Rideau Institute has been this. Canada has already made a significant contribution to Afghanistan, and our government should not agree to any increased combat role for Canada in Afghanistan. Obama can best contribute to peace in Afghanistan by supporting a negotiated end to the war, not by sending thousands of troops to continue fighting it. That's the way forward. We should encourage him to change the U.S. approach in Afghanistan. The war is going poorly for NATO forces. And there's little prospect that things are going to get better. In 2006, I co-authored a report that showed for the first time that Canada is already taking disproportionately high casualties compared to all the other countries in NATO fighting in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is much more dangerous for a Canadian soldier than Iraq is for an American soldier today. We now have lost 97 soldiers. We've lost 2 aid workers, and a diplomat has been killed in the war. That's 100 Canadians dead. And all but 8 of these deaths have occurred since 2006, very recently, when we took up our combat role in Kandahar. The Harper government, along with support from the Liberal Party, has committed Canada to December 2011. That's 3 more years of fighting in Kandahar. How many more are going to die in that time period? The number and manner of civilian casualties is very alarming. It's an even greater tragedy. A recent UN report says that there were 1,445 conflict-related civilian deaths in just the first 8 months of this year. That was an increase of 39% over 2007. Almost any statistic you look at gets worse every year as you move along. Almost as many civilians are killed by our side as by the insurgents. 55%, according to the UN, were killed in insurgent attacks, and 40% were killed by pro-Afghan forces, which include NATO and the U.S. mission itself. And 2/3 of those people were killed from NATO airstrikes. These civilian deaths give fuel to the anger felt across the country. Let me give you an example. Sharafuddin Serozi was quoted in the newspapers recently. He lost 3 children and his wife to an airstrike in Afghanistan. This is what he said: "We're poor farmers. We had absolutely no opinion of America 5 years ago. But now we don't think America is here to help us. If the Taliban will bring peace, we'll support them." So you see, we're losing the most important battle here, which is not against the Taliban, but it's for the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. And it's the attacks, the civilian death toll from the war that's going on is what's causing the problem. Some governments have now come to realize that the war may be lost. And I just want to show you this headline out of the National Post. This is the commander of British forces in October who said, quote, "We're not going to win this war." And I've heard rumors, in fact, that there are memos being produced inside the Canadian government that are telling the upper echelons that the war already may be lost. If we do not try to end the war, the alternative, sooner or later, I believe, is defeat. The same British commander who said that the war was being lost also said that the time has come for peace talks with the insurgents. And we at the Rideau Institute believe that this war will not end in a military victory. Back in 2006, we held a first news conference right in the Parliament buildings with Sadiq Wira, who I think I saw an article about in Mondial, one of the Mondial issues that are in the back here, and you can read about those. With Sadiq Wira, where we called for peace negotiations in order to end what is essentially a civil war in Afghanistan, and we've come in on one side. And you can watch this on YouTube now. We make extensive use of the internet, and you can go to YouTube, Google, or type in Rideau Institute, and you can see the videos of those press conferences. So I hope that when he becomes Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military, Obama will change course in Afghanistan. You know, broadly, his foreign policy supports the general principle of holding talks even with enemies of the United States. He may even find some support in his own military for this. U.S. General David Petraeus is the architect of the successful surge and counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq, and he's now overall commander of U.S. forces in Central Asia and the Middle East, and he's endorsed talks talks with the Taliban. So you see how this idea is moving from the margins that it was only a few years ago into the mainstream now. I mean, and this does give me hope that we will be able to end the war perhaps even much sooner than December 2011. And when our combat troops are currently scheduled to leave Afghanistan. So, to summarize briefly, I've talked about 4 issues facing Canada in the post-Bush era. They include the economy and NAFTA, climate change, energy security, and perhaps most importantly, Afghanistan and foreign policy. And I think there's several priorities for us as citizens to push for in this next government, an agenda for Canada. The first is that we should not be afraid to renegotiate NAFTA and change the deal. You know, we need to bring it into the 21st century and ensure that the environment and labor rights and the public interest are all protected. And we have to stop the rush to the bottom. And we could take it a step further. Any new agreement should also recognize that the oil in Canada does not belong to the United States. And we must bring in our own national energy strategy to ensure that our own energy needs are met first, not after the U.S. satisfies its own rapacious demand first. Regarding climate change, you know, the U.S. will be moving much faster than we are, and it only makes sense to improve our system and coordinate it with theirs so that we get the best possible North American climate change plan, whether it's a cap-and-trade system or a carbon tax or some combination of the two. And we've got to focus on cleaning up the tar sands. We should also examine ways to assist the Canadian manufacturing sector. For decades, our economy was built on fair trade with the United States and in things such as the Auto Pact, which was struck down by the World Trade Organization. We're now losing hundreds of thousands of jobs, and in any renegotiated trade agreement, we must protect labor rights, ensure that labor standards rise, and protect our jobs. On the international front, we have to change the strategy in Afghanistan and recommit ourselves to recommit Canada to UN peacekeeping. Rather than a U.S. build-up, we need to see the U.S. support for the peace process, and we have to involve the United Nations. This is just not something that NATO can handle. And we also need the U.S. to take action on nuclear weapons and disarmament, moving toward their abolition. Stop Bush's Star Wars program from spreading and prevent the weaponization of space. You know, last month we convened a meeting of civil society leaders who work on these issues, and we will continue to bring people together to find ways that we can move our agenda forward. We've established a network of more than 15,000 supporters on ceasefire.ca. I keep a personal blog there. I'm sure lots of folks are already on it. So I mentioned at the onset of my remarks that I'm on this 18-city tour talking about the Obama moment, and what a rich experience it's been. It's been as much about sharing our analysis as well as hearing from Canadians too. And I just wanted to share with you a little bit of the stories that I'm hearing. I've met a healthcare worker in Winnipeg whose job it is to rescue children out of abusive homes. And she couldn't understand why we had almost $18 billion to fight the war, but we had no money, it seemed, to alleviate poverty in her community. I've met auto workers who are losing their jobs because of globalization, and they're seeing the devastating impacts not just on their own lives but even on their communities as well. I was in Peterborough, and there was a young man at the back of the hall. Didn't really say anything, just kept notes through the talk. And at the end he came up and shook my hand, and he said that he'd been planning on joining the military, but now he wasn't so sure about that anymore. I met 2 Afghan students who were studying in Canada, that when he heard about the movement to push for negotiations, they agreed that a negotiated end to the war in Afghanistan was the only way to move forward. So I tell these stories, or I tell these people, and I want to tell you that yes, it's true, there are powerful forces behind the economic elitism and environmental degradation and the militarism in Canada. But you know, every once in a while, our citizens' movements do chalk up one victory once here and there. And I want to tell you about that one success story. Earlier this year, we learned that a U.S. company was going to buy this company's space division. This is a Canadian firm, McDonald Detweiler and Associates, or MDA. MDA's space division is Canada's largest, and they built the Canada arm. And they've also built this important satellite, which is used for Arctic surveillance and monitoring climate change, called RadarSat-2. All of this was going to be sold off to a U.S. buyer. An arms manufacturer, Alliant Tech Systems. And this is what they build: nuclear weapon systems, as well as landmines, cluster bombs, depleted uranium munitions. All of this, Canada Armed RadarSat, was going to be sold off to this firm. We said, no way. No way were we going to stand by and let this happen. We looked at past track record of foreign takeovers. We found that since the 1980s, the government has never stopped a foreign takeover. Not one. So our work was cut out for us. We set a plan in motion. We worked with allies. We worked with folks in all political parties. We worked with messengers like Marc Garneau, Canada's first astronaut, who was opposed to the sale. We worked with academics and experts on Arctic sovereignty like Michael Byers out at UBC. We had employees from MDA itself who were so concerned about what was going to happen with the sale. Some of them resigned outright. Others didn't resign, but still worked with other employees to say, we can't let this happen. And they helped us understand what was at stake. And then finally, as a result of all this, working in Parliament, trying to get a legal opinion through and doing all kinds of media work to try to get the government to stop the sale. Finally, in April 2008, Jim Prentice said he was going to stop the sale. He used his power under the Investment Canada Act to disallow the acquisition of the space division of MDA by U.S. arms manufacturer Alliant Tech System. And so the Canada arm will remain, for now, Canadian. I mean, think about it. There's been 10,000 foreign takeovers since the 1980s. More than 1,600 of them have been reviewed by the government and stamped approved. How many have been denied? Now there's one. There's one. So each victory, such as this one, even though it may seem small, creates big opportunities for us for progressive change. And these imperatives for peace and justice must resonate in Parliament. That's the key. When people of goodwill work together in this way, we will absolutely be amazed at what we can achieve together. And so, to borrow a phrase, yes we can. Thank you very much. Nice. Thanks, Steve.